Morning. So good to see so many of you here. And yes, as has just been said, I am a psychologist, and I'm not going to apologise for that. But I think what is interesting is that somebody said to me yesterday, what's a psychologist doing here at a tissue viability conference? And the answer to that is quite simple. First of all, I completely agree that the patient has to be given a voice. And I think when we measure things like quality of life and well-being, we give an opportunity to patients to give that voice. And I think some of those voices that we just heard then really resound with me because it links into some of the work that I've been doing with colleagues as well. They've said very, very similar things that I've heard in work in Worcestershire and various other areas. Also, I think I've been working in quality of life and well-being for quite a long time. I'm not going to tell you how long because that'll age me. And one of the things I've noticed is we tend to talk about quality of life and well-being as if they are the same thing. However, when I first started work, they were very closely linked. But I think what I've seen over time is that we're losing some of it. We're actually losing the issue around well-being. Can I just ask where the presentation is? Do I need to click it on? Right, okay. So, one of the things that I've really become aware of recently, and it's becoming more and more obvious to me, is that we're talking about them still as if they're the same thing, but we've actually lost sight of what well-being is, and I think that's a real concern, and that's one of the things I want to try and share with you this morning, is my thoughts around that, and perhaps give you an idea of why I think it's important that we try to shift the focus back a little bit. So if we could start just by trying to define quality of life and well-being. I'm sure you've heard about quality of life, you've heard of health-related quality of life. There are lots of measures out there in patient care. And they do have things in common as well as some differences. And I think the main thing that quality of life and well-being have in common is the fact that they're such broad concepts. They cover a whole range of things within our lives. And the thing with quality of life, and it's true more and more with well-being as well, is you'll hear it talked about not just in case of health, but also linked into economics in terms of people's social life, social indicators, all sorts of areas. Because it really does, it's an umbrella term which covers everything we do. So when we're talking about quality of life in health, we tend to be talking about health-related quality of life, which is a subsection of quality of life itself. What's different, though, between these two is that the focus with quality of life, health-related quality of life specifically, tends to be very much about limitations of functioning. So we tend to ask people how the negative aspects in their life are. With well-being, the focus is much more on positivity, and it's much more about growing psychosocial resources. So this is not a semantic difference, this is a really important difference, I believe, and I want to try and explain to you why I think it's so important to see this difference. If we look at quality of life, for example, it's very much about how we think about our condition. If you've got a health condition, if you've got a wound, it's how you think about it and how it affects you. It's very much linked into making a cognitive appraisal of something. With well-being, however, the focus is much more on people's emotional responses. It's about how having a wound makes you feel. Okay, so there is a little bit of a difference there already, hopefully you'll see. Now, you may well say to me, I've seen health-related quality of life measures, and there is a measure of emotional response. We do ask people about things like depression, anxiety, and I'd say, yes, we do, but the focus is on negative emotions. Well-being is not about an absence of negative emotion, it's about the presence of positive emotions. It's about happiness, satisfaction, okay, hope, all those sorts of positive things. And I think at some point along the line we've lost sight of that to an extent. And we tend to think if you just measure the things that seem to be really salient and important, the negative emotions, and if people aren't depressed and they aren't anxious, then that's fine, they must have a good quality of life. But I think we're missing something because we're focusing so much on deficit. We're not looking at assets. And it's perfectly possible for somebody not to be depressed doesn't mean they're happy. Okay, so they're not synonyms. And I think this is partly the way we've ended up at this point is partly because quality of life now is very much a patient outcome, it's a patient-reported outcome measure, and we focus on it as an outcome. And if you get a good quality of life score, brilliant, job done, we'll leave it there. I'd argue that's not true, because I think well-being has a real value because it can act as a mediator and can really impact on people's physical health. And that's the other reason I'm here as a psychologist, because I truly believe that there's an important link between our mental well-being and our physical well-being, and that the two do in fact work together and affect each other. So let's look a little bit more about quality of life and how we measure it. And as I've already said, there are lots of measures out there, and I've just put a few examples up here. And I think I have noticed in the conference proceedings there's been an oral paper about a new measure that's been developed. There's also a poster about a new measure that's being developed. So quality of life is clearly very important, and it matters to clinicians and it matters to patients. But what about well-being? Do we have measures of well-being? Well, what I'd say to you is not quite as good as they could be. The Cardiff Wound Impact Schedule does make a start because it has a well-being scale. But those of you who know it, go back and have a look at it and see what you think, because actually it's not just about positive emotions. It does, again, introduce elements that are negative as well. So I think it's a good starting point, but there's still work that we can do. And this is why I think there's work that we can do. Because a few months ago, we asked a group of clinicians what was more important to their patients. On this definition of quality of life and well-being, what mattered the most? And quite resoundingly, the majority of them, as you can see, said it was well-being. So why is there no measure of well-being? Well, I think one thing is it's actually quite difficult to measure well-being. It can be quite a nebulous concept at times. We haven't really got a handle on it the way we have quality of life. But I think we do need to get a handle on it, and we do need to develop a measure, and we need to start focusing on it. And what I want to do is just explain to you a little bit why, and why it's so important to do that. This diagram, hopefully, will show you the way that there are factors out there that affect our well-being, and some of those are negative. So we have a downward force from those issues such as treatment pain, pain from the wound, all the sort of things that you heard patients talking about there. That can have a negative influence on your well-being. But at the same time, there are certain factors such as people's ability to cope, their resilience, their optimism, positive assets that will actually help people to improve their well-being, so have an upward effect. And what I just want to do now is take you through some of those negative and positive aspects, and you will see that some of these things are issues that were raised by the patients right at the start, so they clearly are very important. And at the side you'll see I've got some quotes from patients from work that we've done over the past few years. I'm not going to read those out, they're just there to illustrate, and so you can see the kinds of things I'm talking about, and I think some of them you will see are again very similar to those voices we heard at the start. So pain, we know pain has a massive impact on people. We know, we heard it at the start. I think it's very interesting as well. Was it Julia Green who spoke yesterday about a measure she's developed of quality of life? And reading the abstract, pain is clearly an important issue that she's highlighted. So we know it matters. And pain can be something that's just happening in the background, or it can be something that links into activities. It can be pain at treatment. And we know very well that if people experience pain, they can also experience stress, and stress can impact on pain again. So we have this cycle that develops. Treatment itself, therefore, can be a problem. We know it's in place to make people feel better, but sometimes the treatment itself can be invasive, it can be inconvenient, and it can hurt. So again, it can have a negative impact on people's well-being. The wound itself, not surprisingly, the fact that it may smell, that may cause embarrassment, it may also be painful. All these things are really going to impact on people's well-being and how good they feel about themselves. So in turn, you're developing more mental health problems, mood disorders. You can see how all those physical things are going to impact on mental health. People may develop depression. They may have problems with their body image. And sometimes, and again, we saw that in those voices at the start, people feel they're not understood. They think clinicians don't always recognise those problems they've got. And in a busy clinic, I'm sure it's quite easy for people to feel that maybe their whole person isn't being looked after. Stress and worry as well. People can get very anxious. We saw that gentleman at the start talking about the fact that he'd like to go back and get to work. But people worry if they can't work. They may worry if they've not got a proper income coming in. They could worry and stress about the treatment that they're having, about the pain, a whole range of things that can really have a sort of impact on people. The way they look as well, their sort of appearance, how people feel about that, that's going to develop frustration and uncertainty. So all sorts of, again, more issues. Social stigma, something else we saw mentioned right at the start. People feeling that they're misunderstood, nobody understands what their wound's like. They may, I remember very clearly speaking to a lady only a few months ago, actually, who really felt that other people could smell her wound, and it put her off going out. She felt really stigmatised and felt she had to stay away from other people. This, of course, leads to social isolation. And we know that isolation from friends and family can be a real issue for anyone with any health problem. The fact that you haven't got those, you know, we're social animals, we need those contacts and those connections, and if people haven't got them, it can be a real difficulty. But people can feel trapped. They can feel trapped because they can't get out. They can feel trapped as well because the treatment is something that prevents them perhaps being as mobile as they might like to be. So in turn, you can see how this might be having an impact on the family. The fact that there could be some emotional strain on relationships, there's a burden on other people around you, and that's not just immediate family, but that's also extended family at times as well. But there are factors that can be really protective, and I think we need to start looking at some of these. These are the elements that I say are psychological resources, and they're important to help people to improve well-being. So if we look, for example, at personality, we talk in psychology about something called the hardy personality. Now, the one thing I would say about all these factors is that we maybe don't know as much about them as we should do and as we could do. We seem to know a lot more, again, about those negative things that impact on people than these positive things. So there's a huge debate around this idea of a hardy personality. The idea that somebody's cognitive style, the way they think about things, the way they rationalise things, could actually make a difference to how they feel and their health. And it was interesting, I had a conversation yesterday with the taxi driver who was asking me what I was doing here and started talking about, oh yeah, well-being, yeah, being positive, that sounds really important. And talking about someone he knew who'd had cancer and actually felt that because they had a dogged, determined personality and they were going to beat this, it really helped them to move into recovery. And I think we've got plenty of anecdotal information around that. What we need to do is get out there and get the systematic information that will support this. But the idea that positive attitudes can have an impact on how people feel and their well-being, the idea that optimism, feeling good about the future, can make a difference, and control, that seems to be really important. People need to feel they have control. So we're coming back to the patient voice again, aren't we? Patients having a say, feeling that they're involved in their treatment, so they understand what's happening to them. But something that seems to be really important as well, it's about being active, being an active problem solver, not just letting things happen to you. One of the big debates, though, is whether hardiness is something we're born with or whether you can learn it and whether it can be something that you develop. And there's more and more information coming out that suggests that actually, yes, some people do seem to have it from the get-go, but that doesn't mean there aren't features and factors of it that you can change for individuals and help them grow and develop those psychological strengths. Likewise, hope, another positive aspect. The idea that somebody can look forward to a future. They may not know exactly how they're going to achieve it, but they know that they have an expectation of something that's going to be really good, that things are going to get better. Again, you can see how hope links into optimism. But the idea of searching for meaning and purpose is really important when we're talking about protecting people's mental health and well-being. And I think the question we have to ask is, can we in some way start to engender hope in people with chronic wounds? Can we help them to develop this if they don't already have it as a part of their repertoire? Resilience. Here's another concept that has become more and more important in psychology in the past few years. And you hear people talk about resilience in so many different aspects. I hear it linked into education. I hear it linked into child development, particularly, for example, you hear it linked into children who've suffered abuse. You hear it linked into people who are living with all sorts of kinds of chronic illnesses. And it seems to be that some people have this ability to live through a difficult experience without it having a negative impact on their mental health. So they don't become depressed. They may go through a traumatic incident, but they don't get traumatic stress afterwards. Are they survivors? Is that how we label them? We probably would label them like that in the public press, you know. But it seems to be that some people are able in some way to cope. They have some resilience. And it has been linked very clearly into positive emotions. Again, we have this big question in psychology. Is it about disposition? Are some people just born resilient and others aren't? And there's also a big question about whether, when we're talking about resilience, does it mean you never have a mental health problem, or does it mean you can be in a difficult situation and actually recover quite quickly? And I'd suggest that probably both are important. If we're just going to talk about those individuals who never have any negative impact, you're excluding a whole group of people who may well dip for a while but pull themselves back up quite quickly. They must have some strong psychological resources to draw on. And what we need to do is to try and find out what those are so we can help develop that for other people. Coping. Now, coping is something you probably have seen written about a lot in the literature. It's something that's been important in health psychology for quite a long time. And we know that the way people cope with illness is important. And we know that those people who are active copers, those people who actually try and find solutions, they're very solution-focused, and those people who address the fact that they do have a health problem, whether it's a wound, a chronic illness, whatever it is, they don't ignore it. They don't say, if I pretend it's not there, it'll go away. It doesn't work, because we know it won't go away. But if I say, right, this is the issue, what am I going to do? What ways am I going to find around this? Those people cope much better. And they seem to have much better well-being and psychological health. Finally then, social support. Social support seems to be so important, and it's a concept that's been around in psychology for a very, very long time. I can remember studying social support as an undergraduate, and believe me, that was a very long time ago. And I think it's become clearer and clearer in more aspects of health that social support really matters. And it can be practical, it can be emotional. Usually a combination of those two, but it really acts as a buffer. And we've been doing some work with the Lindsay Leg Clubs recently, and one of the things we found is that ability to get together in a group, to meet other people who have the same health problem as you, to find out how they cope and what they've done, meet people who've recovered, really has a positive impact on people. And again, work I've done in other sort of areas of chronic illness, I've really found that those people who can meet others in similar situations, it gives them a benchmark. And particularly if they're meeting other people who are coping, or they're meeting other people who've got through it, they're able to develop their own psychological resources, so as they're able to cope better and do all those positive things we've just been talking about. So, well-being is negatively influenced by a range of factors, but it's also positively influenced or perhaps protected by psychosocial factors. And I think that's really important, and we mustn't lose sight of those positive things. We know we can reduce negative factors, and often we work towards doing that. The question is, can we boost the protective factors? Can we actually have an impact on that aspect of well-being as well as on what we would define as being health-related quality of life? Well, I think we need to find an answer to that question, and it's really important. So why is it important? It's important because, coming back to what I said at the start, there is a link between our mental health and our well-being and our physical self. We know from research that's out there, some of the research that colleagues of mine have done as well, we know that things like pain, that having a poor social and psychological support can really impact on an individual. It produces psychological stress, and that's measurable because it has a physical impact as well. As soon as you're under psychological stress, your sort of immune system changes, your immune responses change because of a whole range of chemicals that come into play. And if that happens, you also find that you have changed behavioural responses. So if pain equals psychological stress equals changes in immune response, changes in behaviour, it can impact on wound healing. And the question we want to answer is, can we use well-being as a protective factor which supports people against that? And what we're suggesting, I'm not sure if this is exactly right yet, but this is what we're working on at the moment, some research we're undertaking presently, is whether we can develop this as a model. We know that we've got these negative things that have an impact on people. We know that they impact on both quality of life and well-being. And I'm quite keeping those as distinct concepts because I think we have to now. We know that happens. We also know that psychological resources can impact on somebody's well-being, and that therefore has its own psychological outcome. Now, we also know that what happens with that is it joins the loop and goes back and has a further impact on pain, symptoms, etc., how people cope with treatments. Which means that if you've got good well-being and good psychological resources to draw on, your psychological outcomes are going to be positive, and that'll have a positive effect on your physical self. If it's negative, obviously, the opposite's going to happen. So my question is, do we need to stop focusing so much on quality of life and look far more at well-being? Start to bring our focus back to the positives. So we know we've got these negative factors, and we know we've got these positive factors that influence well-being. And what I'd suggest is it's a balancing act. At the moment, we're focusing much more on these issues here. Do we need to start bringing it over to here so we're redressing the balance? So in summary, quality of life and well-being are not synonyms, and we need to stop treating them as such. Quality of life is about negative psychological variables, certainly when we're measuring it in health, whereas well-being is about assessing those positive psychological facets. And again, as I said earlier, we mustn't forget that the positive and negative are not on the same continuum, and that just the absence of negative problems doesn't mean we have good well-being. I think one of the issues is, as I said to you, I have seen measures change over the years, and I think this is what's happening, is that we don't want the burden on patients to be too great, so we shorten our measures of quality of life. And I've done a lot of psychometrics, I've done a lot of development of measures, and we start out with this huge pool of items which have positives and negatives in there. We give it to patients, we go through the psychometric process, we come out with a questionnaire which seems to cover everything. It will have a balance of positive and negatives, but it's quite long. So, because we don't want the burden on patients to be great, we go back and do some more psychometrics, and we develop this shortened version. And inevitably, the shortened version takes away those positive aspects, those things that I'm now calling well-being. And I think the reason for that is because things like pain, treatment difficulty, etc., are so salient to patients because they're in this health setting that some of the positives get forgotten. But I want to bring the focus back to that. And the way we need to do that is, first of all, learn how to measure well-being, which is some work I've got going on at the moment, trying to develop a measure of well-being. And then can we use that, once we have isolated those issues, if you like, to actually promote people's well-being and thereby promote healing as well. Thank you.